The key question you will answer is, how did Piedmont prepare for war? Throughout his life, Cavour wanted considerable change, though change in the direction rather of Italian independence than unification. Because he wrote in passionate terms of the need to secure Italy's independence from foreign powers, which meant, in effect, from Austria, it has sometimes been assumed that he wanted to create a united nation state. The fact that he did not believe such a development to be remotely possible until the shattering events of 1859 and 1860 transformed the situation should not obscure the sincerity with which he anticipated the independence of all Italian states. After Plombières and the secret treaty, Cavour began to prepare Italians psychologically for war by writing an emotional anti-Austrian speech for Victor Emmanuel to give at the opening of Parliament in January 1859. This included the words, "We cannot be insensitive to the cry of anguish," or in Italian, "grido di dolore," that comes to us from many parts of Italy. Grido di dolore quickly became a catchphrase throughout Italy to express popular anti-Austrian feelings. Nationalistic feelings were heightened. Cavour also mobilized the Piedmontese army in March of 1859, but without Louis Napoleon's support, he could not risk fighting alone with Austria. There must be no repetition of Piedmont's defeat by Austria at the Battle of Castuso just over a decade earlier. Yet still war did not begin, and there were signs that Napoleon was beginning to get cold feet. Unless Austria could be made to appear the aggressor, he reasoned, it might be better to abandon the idea of war and turn instead to a congress of the great powers to settle the Italian question, an idea which displeased Cavour. He feared that Piedmont would not find a place at such a conference and would be considered feeble and powerless by the rest of Italy. But all he could do was express his hope to the French Emperor that Austria will before long commit one of those aggressive acts which will justify your armed intervention. "I hope so with all my heart," Cavour said. In other words, he was hoping that something would turn up. In April 1859, something did turn up. Austria issued a demand that Piedmont should demobilize its army. The Austrians themselves had mobilized a large army in northern Italy the previous month, fearing a possible attack, but they could not afford the expense of keeping it at the ready for very long. They dared not disband while Piedmont still had an army ready for war, and so took the dangerous step of sending an ultimatum. Cavour refused to comply, and Victor Emmanuel issued a proclamation, "People of Italy, Austria provokes Piedmont. I fight for the right of the whole nation. I have no other ambition than to be the first soldier of Italian independence." Austria replied by declaring war on April 29, 1859. A few days later, Napoleon declared support for his ally. The war known to the Italians as the Second War of Independence, the first being the one fought against the Austrians in 1849, had begun. It was a short, violent, and terrible conflict. The war started slowly, marked by chaos, confusion, and unpreparedness on both sides. Napoleon's troops traveled to Italy by train, as benefited a modern army, but owing to bad organization, they arrived in Lombardy before their equipment and provisions. "We have sent an army of 120,000 men into Italy before we have stocked up supplies," Napoleon complained to Paris. There were not enough tents for the men, and even worse, there was not enough ammunition. The only consolation was that the Austrian and Piedmontese generals were even more incompetent, so that it was some time before fighting could actually begin. Lombardy was quickly overrun by French and Piedmontese forces. The Austrians were defeated at Magenta on June 4th, and by the French army, and at Solferino on June 24th by a combined French and Piedmontese force. The carnage at both battles and on both sides was horrific. The Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I, Victor Emmanuel II, and Napoleon III, all present as spectators, were deeply shocked. Better to lose a province than undergo such a horrible experience again, mused the young Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. Napoleon offered his personal linen to be torn up as bandages for his men, but this gesture hardly compensated the wounded for the fact that official bandages, along with the medical and other supplies, did not arrive until after the war was over. Hence, many who were terribly maimed often lay for hours on the battlefield without any help until death ended their suffering. The local peasantry stripped the boots from the bodies of the dead and dying alike. At Solferino, the French lost 12,000 men, the Austrians even more. The only good thing to come out of this useless slaughter was the arrival on the battlefield of the Swiss journalist Henry Beaunat, whose reports of the horrors led eventually to the formation of the Red Cross organization, which is an international agency founded in 1864 to assist those who were wounded or captured in wars. The war was short, thankfully, only 7 weeks, because Napoleon suddenly made a truce with Austria. In August, he met Franz Joseph at Villafranca and agreed on an armistice. He did not consult his Piedmontese allies over the terms. He simply informed King Victor Emmanuel II what they were, and the king accepted without consulting Cavour. According to the terms of this agreement, Piedmont would receive Lombardy, although to allow Austria to save face, it would first be ceded to France and then pass by Napoleon to Victor Emmanuel. The previous rulers of Tuscany, Modena, and Parma, who had fled during revolts in their lands, were to be restored to their duchies. This was the theory, although it was not clear how it was to be achieved, and it soon became apparent that they would never return. Austria still kept Venetia and therefore remained a powerful influence in Italy. Why did Napoleon make a sudden unexpected truce with Austria without consulting Cavour? There are many possibilities. First, as a military leader, Napoleon did not have the stomach for war. The battles of Magenta and Solferino, with their great loss of life, affected him severely. He may well have felt that by bringing the war to an end, he could avoid further bloodbath. Also, the Austrians had been defeated but not routed. Thus, there was little hope that what was left of the French and Piedmontese army could breach the Austrian defenses. Reinforcements would be needed, and obtaining these would take time, and the casualties in a further round of fighting would be high. There was danger, too, that Prussia, already mobilizing along the Rhine frontier, might take advantage of Napoleon's absence to attack France. Alternatively, Prussia might decide to come to the aid of Austria if the war were allowed to continue, and a combined Prusso-Austrian army might prove invincible. Also, in France itself, there was growing criticism of the whole Italian adventure, and Napoleon was becoming increasingly suspicious of Cavour's activities. In Tuscany, the Grand Duke had left his duchy and gone to Vienna, and a provincial government had announced that it wished Tuscany to be united with Piedmont. Revolution had spread to Modena and Parma, where Piedmontese armies moved in and took over, setting up provincial governments, while Cavour's agents were known to be encouraging revolution in the Papal States. It seemed to Napoleon that Piedmont was trying to gain more territory and more power than had been agreed at Plombières. Napoleon III considered that Piedmont was doing well, indeed too well, out of the war. On the other hand, the French Emperor himself, aware that he had not, as promised at Plombières, driven Austria out of Italy, could not demand Nice and Savoy as his share of the spoils. Nevertheless, Cavour felt that he had been badly let down. He disliked the fact that Austria still controlled Venetia and was appalled with the suggestive arrangement in Tuscany, Modena, and Parma. He was also furious that he had not been consulted over the ending of the war. Generally a calm, reasonable man who knew the importance of compromise, Cavour also had a terrible temper. In a historical interview where he yelled and screamed at Victor Emmanuel, he appeared to lose control of himself. He insisted that Piedmont should continue the war against Austria without French aid. When the king very sensibly refused, he resigned as prime minister. Cavour was out of office for the next 9 months, yet the situation turned out to be far better for Piedmont than he had imagined. His work as prime minister had borne fruit. Piedmont may not have extended its influence quite as quickly as he had hoped, but the growth in its power was unmistakable. In Tuscany, a carefully rigged assembly voted unanimously in August for annexation by Piedmont. So too did Modena, Parma, and Romagna in the Papal States. Because of the expected opposition of Napoleon, however, these unions were not immediately put into effect. Instead, provisional pro-Piedmontese governments were left to control of each of them. The armistice of Villafranca developed into a peace conference held in Zurich in November, and this time Piedmont was invited to send representatives. The Peace of Zurich arranged that Lombardy was to be handed over first by Austria to France and then by Napoleon to Piedmont. The problems of the central Italy were shelved, to be dealt with by one of Napoleon III's favorite methods, a congress, although objections from the Pope, who feared that he might lose territory in the Papal States, meant that it never took place. Hence, when Cavour returned as prime minister, he was able to put the finishing touches to Piedmont's expansion, or, from another perspective, to the unification of northern Italy. In mid-March of 1860, in Tuscany, the population voted for a union with Piedmont. Despite Villafranca, the new state of Emilia, made up of the duchies of Modena and Parma together with Romagna, did the same. This was in fact a foregone conclusion. The war with Austria had whipped up nationalist feelings, and the provincial governments had carried out extensive propaganda campaigns. In Turin, decrees were soon published declaring that Tuscany and Emilia were now part of the Kingdom of Piedmont. By this time, Cavour realized that one way to restore good relations with Napoleon was to arrange for Nice and Savoy to be handed over to him without further delay. A secret treaty between Victor Emmanuel and Napoleon in March transferred Savoy and Nice to France, subject to the results of a popular vote in both places. These votes were taken in April, and again huge majorities voted in favor of union. The result in French-speaking Savoy was not unexpected, but in Nice, which was Italian-speaking, the votes were suspicious. The presence of a French army in Nice on its way home from Lombardy may have had something to do with it. Here's a chart of the War of 1859 and the different consequences. As we can see, the war starts France and Piedmont versus Austria. There are early French victories and Piedmont victories. The Austrians retired to their quadrilateral, which was their defense area. Piedmont gets Lombardy as a result. Austria keeps Venetia, so Italy's still not unified as of yet. In the end, among those who questioned the accuracy of the results was Garibaldi, who had been born in Nice and was one of its elected representatives in the Piedmontese parliament. The transfer of Nice to France, he later recalled, made him feel a foreigner in the land of my birth. He was preparing a military expedition to prevent Nice being taken over by France when he was diverted by an outbreak of revolution in southern Italy, on the island of Sicily.